November 16, 1944, 30,000 feet above the Western Caroline Islands. A single Nakajima C-6N1 reconnaissance aircraft, Allied codename Mert, breaks through the cloud layer and levels off over a coral ring that nobody in Tokyo had ever heard of 2 months earlier. The pilot stares down at a lagoon roughly 22 miles long and 15 wide. What he sees stops him cold. Below him, spread across the turquoise water like a steel city dropped onto the ocean, are 4 American fleet carriers, 3 battleships, a dozen cruisers, rows of destroyers moored in neat lines, and beyond them, filling the southern and central anchorages as far as the eye can see, hundreds of supply ships, oilers, ammunition vessels, repair ships, and floating dry docks the size of apartment buildings. He counts what he can and turns for home. 3 days later, the Japanese submarine I-47 surfaces just 4.5 nautical miles off the reef. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, raises his periscope for a daylight observation. He counts what he can see and logs his findings. His report notes over 100 ships at anchor, a golden opportunity, but there are only 2 submarines and 8 human torpedoes available. A regrettable matter. Aboard I-47 is Lieutenant Junior Grade Sekio Nishina, co-inventor of the Kaiten, Japan's manned suicide torpedo, carrying the ashes of his dead collaborator Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki. Nishina climbs into his Kaiten before dawn on November 20, 1944, and is launched toward the lagoon. His weapon strikes the fleet oiler USS Mississinawa and kills 63 American sailors. It does not change a single thing, because what Orita is looking at through that periscope is not merely a fleet at anchor, it is a floating, mobile, infinitely renewable American naval base, 1,300 miles from Tokyo. A base that did not exist 3 months earlier. By March of 1945, there will be more than 600 American ships moored inside that reef. By the end of the war, Service Squadron 10, the unit that built and ran that base, will own more seagoing tonnage than the entire surviving Imperial Japanese Navy. This is the story of how American logistics broke the Imperial Japanese Navy long before the kamikazes and the atomic bombs, and why, when Japan's surviving admirals were asked to explain the defeat, they answered with something close to despair. To understand the shock of 1944, we have to go back to the warning of 1940. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had spent 5 years in the United States. First, as a language student at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, then as naval attaché in Washington. He had ridden American trains, he had walked American factory floors, he had read American steel production statistics. By the time the Tripartite Pact pulled Japan toward war with the Anglo-Saxon powers, Yamamoto was perhaps the only flag officer in Tokyo who genuinely understood what was on the other side of the ocean. His most often cited statement is, in fact, not the famous sleeping giant line. There is no documentary evidence Yamamoto ever wrote or said those words. The quote appeared in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. Director Richard Fleischer said the film's producer, Elmo Williams, had found it in Yamamoto's diary. Williams himself said screenwriter Larry Forrester had discovered it in a 1943 letter from Yamamoto to the Admiralty in Tokyo. But Yamamoto kept no diary, the letter was never produced, and historians, including Donald Goldstein and Hiroyuki Agawa, reject the quote as fiction. What Yamamoto actually said is even more pointed. In 1940, asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe about Japan's prospects in a war with the United States, Yamamoto answered plainly, "If we are ordered to do it, then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." And in a private comment recorded in his correspondence and quoted by his biographer Hiroyuki Agawa, Yamamoto put it even more bluntly. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. This was not poetry. This was an industrial forecast, and Yamamoto was right almost to the month. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4 through 7, 1942, occurred precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor. After Midway, the war Yamamoto had warned about, the war of attrition, replacement, and supply, began in earnest. Yamamoto did not live to see what came next. He was killed when his transport aircraft was shot down over Bougainville on April 18, 1943. But his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, survived that same ambush. Ugaki kept a diary throughout the war, published in English in 1991 under the title Fading Victory. From late 1943 onward, it reads as a slow, grinding inventory of disbelief at the rate at which American ships, aircraft, and supplies kept appearing on the horizon. The American capacity Yamamoto warned about did not appear by accident. It was legislated into existence. On June 17, 1940, 3 days after German troops entered Paris, Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark walked up to Capitol Hill and asked Congress for $4 billion to expand the United States combat fleet by 70%. 257 ships, totaling 1,325,000 tons. The House of Representatives passed his bill 316-0 in less than an hour of debate. On July 19, 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Two-Ocean Navy Act into law. The numbers it authorized deserve a moment of silence. In a single statute, the United States ordered 385,000 tons of capital ships, 200,000 tons of aircraft carriers, 420,000 tons of cruisers, 250,000 tons of destroyers, 70,000 tons of submarines, 15,000 naval aircraft, and 100,000 tons of auxiliary vessels. That single act set in motion a fleet larger than the entire pre-existing United States Navy, which displaced roughly 1,250,000 tons. America was not merely adding to its navy, it was building a second, bigger navy beside the first. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor 17 months later, the United States Navy still had only 7 carriers, 17 battleships, and roughly 790 commissioned warships. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the United States had nearly 100 carriers of all types, 23 battleships, and nearly 6,800 commissioned vessels. And that was not even the full picture. Outside the Navy yards entirely, a man named Henry Kaiser was about to rewrite the rules of shipbuilding. Henry Kaiser had never built a ship in his life when the war began. He had built the Hoover Dam. He understood mass production, prefabrication, and welding. The United States Maritime Commission gave him a chance, and he industrialized the merchant fleet the way Henry Ford had industrialized the automobile. The standard cargo ship of the war was the Liberty ship, 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, 11 knots, capable of carrying 2,840 jeeps, 440 light tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. Before the war, comparable freighters took roughly 8 months to a year to build. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's Permanente Metals yard in Richmond, California, was averaging about 45 days. By 1944, the Maritime Commission was averaging under 3 weeks. In November 1942, in a publicity stunt explicitly designed to terrify the Axis with what American mass production could do, Kaiser's yard welded together hull, number 47, and christened the SS Robert E. Peary. The keel was laid at midnight on November 8th. The hull slid down the ways on November 12. Total time from keel laying to launch, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. She was delivered fully outfitted on November 15, 7 days from keel to delivery. Henry Kaiser called her his incentive ship. By war's end, American shipyards had launched 2,710 Liberty ships. Kaiser's yards alone produced roughly 1,490 vessels of all types for the Maritime Commission. Then there were the warships. Kaiser proposed to build small aircraft carriers from prefabricated parts, 3 months apiece. The Navy initially refused. He went over their heads to President Roosevelt. Between April 1943 and July 1944, 15 months, Kaiser's Vancouver, Washington Yard launched all 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers. Roughly 1 new aircraft carrier every 3 weeks. They were small, slow, lightly armored, and the crews joked that CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But at the Battle of Sama in October 1944, a handful of them held off Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the 64,000-ton super battleship Yamato herself. The aircraft numbers were even more lopsided. In 1939, American factories built fewer than 3,000 military airplanes. By 1944, the annual figure was 96,318. Total wartime production exceeded 300,000 aircraft of all types. Japan, by contrast, built roughly 76,000 military aircraft over the entire war. The United States built more airplanes in 1944 alone than Japan built across the entire conflict. That was the foundation, but production was only half the answer. The other half was what to do with all those ships once they were built. The Pacific Ocean is roughly 64 million square miles of water. From the west coast of the United States to Tokyo is more than 5,000 nautical miles. From Pearl Harbor to Yokosuka is 3,400. Even the most powerful fleet in the world was useless if it had to crawl back to Pearl Harbor every time a destroyer ran out of bunker oil. The man who solved this problem, and who more than any other single officer articulated the doctrine that won the Pacific, was Rear Admiral Worrell Reed Carter. Carter was an old submariner, born at sea in 1885, aboard the sailing ship Storm King. His 1953 official history is titled Beans, Bullets, and Black Oil. The title comes from a New Year 1945 dispatch by Admiral William Halsey, praising Service Squadron 10's work, and noting that beans, bullets, black oil, bulk stores, and even bulkheads have been promptly forthcoming on each request. That single sentence captures the philosophy. Logistics was not a quartermaster's afterthought to be sorted out after the battle plan. Logistics was the battle plan. Without bulkheads, there were no battleships. Without black oil, the bulkheads were just floating steel. By February 1944, Admiral Raymond Spruance had selected Carter to build up Service Squadron 10, what Admiral Chester Nimitz himself would later call the Navy's secret weapon. The squadron's unofficial motto, stenciled on bulkheads and tucked into staff manuals, captured Carter's philosophy in a single line. If we've got it, you can have it. The technical core of American mobile logistics was underway replenishment. Fuel transferred from oiler to warship at sea, both ships steaming side by side at 12 to 16 knots. The technique itself was not new. The United States Navy had pioneered it in the spring of 1917, when the oiler, USS Maumee, under a young engineering officer named Lieutenant Commander Chester Nimitz, refueled 34 destroyers at sea over several months in the North Atlantic. The same Chester Nimitz who, a quarter century later, would command the entire Pacific Fleet. The instrument that made underway replenishment routine was the Cimarron-class fleet oiler. 35 were built between 1939 and 1942. Each was 553 feet long, 75 feet of beam, 18 knots, flat out, fast enough to steam with a fast carrier task force. Each could carry roughly 146,000 barrels of fuel oil, with separate tankage for aviation, gasoline, and diesel. Each could fuel 2 warships simultaneously, one off each broadside. By Operation Forager in June 1944, the fueling group attached to the 5th Fleet comprised approximately 24 oilers organized into 8 task units, each consisting of 3 oilers escorted by destroyers. The fleet's logistics officer calculated that Operation Forager would require about 100,000 barrels of fuel per day, roughly the cargo of a single oiler emptied every 24 hours. To find each other on the open Pacific, the oilers and combatants rendezvoused in designated rectangles of open water, each 75 miles long and 25 miles wide, given a code name borrowed from a real American oil company. The task force commander would radio a single word, the name of an oil company, and the fleet oilers would know exactly which patch of empty ocean to steer for. The choreography of an underway replenishment was extraordinary. The oiler would steam on a steady course at 12 knots. A destroyer or cruiser would approach from astern, matching speed and closing to within 60 to 80 feet. A messenger line was fired across by a line-throwing gun, and from that thin cord a heavier line was hauled, then a fuel hose, until thick black rubber lines hung between the 2 ships in a shallow curve, pumping fuel oil at hundreds of gallons per minute, while both vessels ploughed through the Pacific swells side by side. A wandering wave, a helmsman's error of even a few degrees, and the hoses would snap and both ships could collide. The seamanship required was among the most demanding in the Navy. By February 1945, Service Squadron 10 was running a continuous shuttle of 40 fleet oilers between Ulithi and the front lines. Over the course of the war, Service Squadron 6 alone, the at-sea replenishment force, delivered 8,352,000 barrels of fuel oil at sea, 23,408,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, 2,500 tons of food, and 13,600 tons of general ammunition, all transferred ship to ship in the open ocean while both vessels were underway. That included 816-inch battleship shells, 300,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition, and more than 18,500-pound bombs. Sailors rolled those bombs across the deck by hand and levered them across high lines to the carrier alongside. Within weeks, an entire ammunition ship was permanently embedded with each oiler group. Carriers could expend their entire ordnance load, striking Tokyo, sail through the night to a rendezvous, rearm in 3 sequential passes, fuel, then ammunition, then food and stores, and disappear back over the horizon to strike again the next morning. This was not a tactic. It was a revolution in the geometry of naval war. After May 1944, no American fleet ever again had to come back to a base. The base came to it. But even underway replenishment had limits. A fleet eventually needs hull repairs, magazine reloads beyond what sea transfer can manage, fresh water distillation, medical facilities, and rest. The fleet needed a forward base, but a base 5,000 miles from California. In September 1944, Nimitz spotted an unremarkable coral ring on a Pacific Ocean areas chart and asked his planners about it. Ulithi Atoll, in the Western Caroline Islands, 1,300 miles south of Tokyo, 850 miles east of the Philippines, consists of 40 tiny islets strung around that vast lagoon. Total dry land amounted to less than 2 square miles. Total population, roughly 400 native Yapese and 3 Japanese soldiers manning a weather station. On September 23, 1944, the 323rd Regimental Combat Team of the 81st Infantry Division landed unopposed. A few days later, the Seabees came ashore. A survey ship sounded the lagoon and reported it could comfortably anchor 700 capital ships, a capacity larger than Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, Ulithi was the largest naval base on Earth. Carter's Service Squadron 10 staff converted it into a complete floating city. The flagship of the squadron, the tender Ocelot, anchored in the lagoon with administrative offices coordinating the movements of hundreds of vessels. Destroyer tenders arrived to service the tin cans, the sleek grey destroyers that burned through fuel and spare parts faster than any other class of ship in the fleet. The repair ship, USS Ajax, carried an air-conditioned optical shop where technicians could regrind the lenses of fire control rangefinders, and a metal fabrication facility capable of forging any alloy needed for emergency hull repairs. Her sister ship, USS Hector, handled landing craft and smaller vessels. The distillation ship, USS Abatan, disguised as an ordinary tanker, made fresh water for the fleet and baked pies and bread in industrial ovens that ran around the clock. A floating ice cream barge produced 500 gallons per shift, because the Navy had learned long ago that morale runs on small pleasures as much as on grand strategy. Mail arrived by seaplane and was sorted aboard a dedicated mail distribution ship. A floating dry dock workshop handled everything from propeller straightening to radar calibration. For recreation, the Seabees built a fleet recreation center on Mogmog Island, capable of accommodating 8,000 enlisted men and 1,000 officers daily, including a 1,200-seat theatre completed in 20 days, with a stage roofed by a Quonset hut where performers and Navy bands played for audiences of sunburned sailors who had been at sea for months. The lagoon itself filled. By December 8, 1944, a famous photograph taken from the carrier USS Ticonderoga shows the carriers Wasp, Yorktown, Hornet, Hancock, and Ticonderoga herself anchored in a row. The men nicknamed the formation Murderers' Row. As the Okinawa invasion forces gathered, estimates placed the peak count at over 600 ships simultaneously at anchor. More vessels in one lagoon than the entire surviving Imperial Japanese Navy possessed in commission. Among the most spectacular pieces of Service Squadron 10 were the floating dry docks, the advanced base sectional docks. Each large dock was assembled from 10 prefabricated sections, each 256 feet wide and 80 feet long, weighing 3,850 tons. Welded together, the assembled dock stretched 927 feet long, with an inside clear width of 133 feet and a lift capacity of 90,000 tons, enough to raise an Iowa-class battleship or an Essex-class carrier completely out of the water. The astonishing part is how they got there. The sections were towed across the Pacific, thousands of miles of open ocean at speeds of just a few knots, through storms and heavy seas. Tugs nursed them along for weeks at a time. On arrival in tropical lagoons, dive teams and construction crews married the sections together, welding them into a single functional dock that could swallow a battleship whole. This meant the Americans could repair battle-damaged capital ships within a few hundred miles of the front lines, instead of sending them back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. A carrier that took a kamikaze hit off the Philippines no longer needed to limp 5,000 miles to San Francisco. She could steam to Ulithi or Manus, enter a floating dry dock that had been towed there from the other side of the world, and be back in action in weeks rather than months. The story that proves the concept happened 2.5 years before Ulithi, and it remains one of the most extraordinary feats of repair in naval history. After the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7 and 8, 1942, the carrier USS Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27, trailing a 10-mile oil slick. A Japanese armor-piercing bomb had punched through her flight deck and detonated above her forward engine room, destroying 6 watertight compartments, wrecking her No. 2 elevator gears, and rupturing her fuel oil bunkers. 8 near misses had opened seams along much of her hull. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, riding her home, estimated the repair work at 90 days. Nimitz did not have 90 days. His cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code and warned that Yamamoto's combined fleet was already steaming toward Midway with 4 fleet carriers. Nimitz needed Yorktown in 3. When Yorktown eased into dry dock No. 1 at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard on the morning of May 28, Nimitz waded into the still draining basin, looked at her ruptured hull, and told his hull repair specialist 3 words: "We need her in 3 days." Roughly 1,400 civilian tradesmen worked around the clock for 72 hours under floodlights. Welders, ship fitters, electricians, and pipe fitters swarmed over the carrier's hull and interior spaces. Honolulu itself endured rolling blackouts, so the shipyard could draw enough current to keep the welders running. Steel plates were cut, shaped, and welded into place over the gaping wounds in her hull. Damaged compartments were shored up with timber and steel bracing. The ruptured fuel tanks were patched and tested. New wiring was run through passageways, still blackened by smoke. When the 3 days were up, Yorktown's repairs were not complete. They were not even close to complete by peacetime standards. Entire compartments remained sealed off and flooded. Her watertight integrity was compromised in several areas, but she could steam, she could launch aircraft, and she could fight. Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor on May 30. The work in dry dock had taken just 48 hours. Her superheater boilers were not fully repaired, and her top speed was reduced. But she sailed. And at Midway, her air group flew the strikes that helped sink the Japanese carriers Soryu and Hiryu. Yamamoto's intelligence officers had reported Yorktown sunk at Coral Sea. When Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike planes found her on June 4, they thought they were attacking a different carrier entirely. The shock of finding a carrier in fighting trim that should still have been in dry dock was the first tremor of what would become a constant Japanese complaint. The Americans repaired faster than Japan could damage. 3 years later, that lesson played out on a vastly larger scale. On March 19, 1945, off the coast of Kyushu, a single Japanese dive bomber put 2 bombs into the carrier USS Franklin. The explosions detonated, fueled, and armed aircraft on her flight deck and rockets on her hangar deck. 807 men were killed, the worst casualties suffered by any surviving United States warship of the war. She listed 13 degrees, lost all power, and drifted to within 52 miles of the Japanese mainland. She was towed until her engineers regained partial steam, then limped under her own power to Ulithi for emergency repairs. After Service Squadron 10 patched her enough to cross the Pacific, Franklin steamed under her own power 12,000 miles from Ulithi to Pearl Harbor to the Panama Canal to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The reason she went to Brooklyn instead of a closer yard on the West Coast was simple. Every single West Coast shipyard was already full of carriers damaged by kamikazes. By April 1945, the United States had so many damaged carriers that the entire Pacific shipbuilding coast was over capacity, so Franklin sailed to Brooklyn. That was logistical depth. If Service Squadron 10 was the Navy's mobile base, the Seabees, the United States Naval Construction Battalions, were the men who turned captured atolls into airfields and harbors before the gunfire stopped. The construction battalions were officially established on March 5, 1942, partly in response to the fate of the civilian construction workers captured by the Japanese on Wake Island. Those civilians had not been permitted to fight back under international law. The Seabees solved that problem permanently. Their men were trained both as construction tradesmen and as combat infantry. Their motto became Construimus Batuimus, we build, we fight. The average age of a Seabee in 1943 was 37, far older than the typical Marine or sailor. These were experienced carpenters, electricians, heavy equipment operators, steel workers, and plumbers who had built bridges and highways in civilian life. Now they were building the road to Tokyo, one coral airstrip at a time. By the end of the war, Seabee battalions had operated on 6 continents, constructed more than 300 advance bases, and laid down everything from airstrips and breakwaters to hospitals, fuel tank farms, and submarine pens. Their work was often done under fire. Seabees earned over 2,000 Purple Hearts during the war. A few timelines tell the story. Aslito Field, Saipan, June 1944. Seabees landed with the 4th Marine Division on June 15. The field was captured by the 27th Infantry Division on June 18. 3 companies filled the bomb craters with stockpiled coral, recommissioned 2 captured Japanese road rollers, and had the entire 4,500-foot main runway operational for American aircraft within 2 days of capture. Northfield, Tinian, August 1944. 15,000 Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Brigade hauled, blasted, and packed enough coral to fill 3 times the volume of Hoover Dam. By spring 1945, they had built the largest airfield in the world. 4 runways, each 8,500 feet long, with hardstands for 265 B-29 superfortresses. A second airfield, Westfield, added 2 more runways of equal length. Construction veterans called the work on Tinian the miracle of construction. From Northfield, the Enola, Gay and Boxcar would lift off in August 1945. Yontan and Kadena airfields, Okinawa, April 1945. The 6th Marine Division captured Yontan by 1 in the afternoon on the first day of the invasion. The 7th Infantry Division captured Kadena the same morning. Both fields were operational for American aircraft within 72 hours. Every Pacific island the United States captured became another logistics base, another set of runways, another fuel depot. A cumulative process that shortened the American supply line every time it advanced and lengthened the Japanese supply line every time it retreated. Why could Japan not do any of this? Part of the answer was industrial. Japan's pre-war economy produced roughly 1/10 of America's industrial output. By 1944, when American factories were producing over 96,000 aircraft a year, Japan produced 28,180. Japan's total wartime warship construction came to approximately 1,048,000 tons. The United States Navy commissioned more than 10 times that tonnage in the same period. But the deeper answer was doctrinal, and it came directly from Japan's own senior officers in their post-war testimony. Fleet Admiral Osami Nagano, the most senior surviving officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had served as naval attaché in Washington in the early 1920s. When Nagano was interrogated by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in November 1945, he was asked what had ultimately defeated Japan. His answer was unsparing. The difference in the speed and effectiveness with which you carried out those things, namely keeping up and increasing of forces, was so much greater than the speed and effectiveness with which we were able to do it. Behind that difference was the difference in production capacity of the 2 countries. We were far behind you in civil engineering technique, airfield construction. We were very poorly equipped as compared with you who were able to produce sufficient arms, many kinds of them, in tremendous quantities. This was not a fighting admiral talking about tactics. This was the chief of the Naval General Staff talking about factory floors and bulldozers. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, went further. Asked why Japan had failed to hold its defensive perimeter, Toyoda told his interrogators something devastating in its simplicity. I think there was a mistake at the top from the very beginning as to the nature of modern warfare. We had at the beginning only 6 million tons of ship bottom, and once the war started, The plan adopted was to build 1,000,000 tons annually. 1,000,000 tons a year. That was what the Americans were soon launching every 6 weeks. Toyota also addressed the fundamental strategic miscalculation. If a little closer study had been made of the fighting going on between England and Germany around the Mediterranean, the fighting that meant so much consumption of material, and if we had laid our plans with some sounder ideas as to the nature of modern war, it might have been different. In other words, Japan went to war planning a Tsushima, a single decisive battle. The United States went to war planning a system. Japan's war plan rested on what the Imperial Navy called Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, supported by raw materials seized from the Dutch East Indies. Japan controlled the world's largest concentration of oil fields outside the United States and the Soviet Union. Production from Japanese-controlled fields peaked at almost 4 million barrels per month in 1943. The problem was that Japan never figured out how to bring the oil home. Toyota began the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. The wartime plan was to add 1 million tons annually. Japan instead lost approximately 8,900,000 tons of merchant shipping during the war. Virtually the entire pre-war fleet plus all wartime construction, gone. American submarines did most of the killing. Of those merchant losses, United States submarines sank approximately 4,800,000 tons, about 55% of the total. Tanker losses were catastrophic. Japanese tanker tonnage, destroyed in 1944 alone, was roughly 2.8 times greater than the entire stock of tankers Japan had remaining by 1945. The last tanker from Southeast Asia reached Japan in March 1945. By April, Japan's oil imports had effectively reached zero. The effect on daily life in Japan was devastating. Civilian fuel rations were slashed to almost nothing. Factories that depended on imported raw materials began shutting down. The fishing fleet, which fed much of the population, could not put to sea for lack of diesel fuel. Railroad schedules were cut back because there was no coal or oil to run the trains. Japan's merchant marine had been the circulatory system of the empire, carrying not just oil but iron ore, bauxite, rubber, rice, and every other commodity that an island nation needed to survive. When American submarines severed that circulatory system, the empire did not just lose its military capability, it began to starve. Japan's response to the fuel crisis tells you everything about the doctrinal gap. The imperial government mobilized millions of civilians, including entire classes of schoolchildren, to dig up pine roots. About 37,000 improvised distillation units yielded roughly 70,000 barrels of pine oil, from which only 3,000 barrels of usable aviation gasoline were ever refined. The fuel was so contaminated that post-war American jeeps using it suffered immediate engine failure. Meanwhile, Japan's largest warships were forced to base near the oil fields in Singapore and Borneo because they could not be fueled in the home islands. By 1944, the surface fleet was running on unrefined Borneo crude oil. The dangers of that fuel were demonstrated catastrophically when the carrier Taiho was torpedoed at the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. A torpedo from the submarine USS Albacore ruptured her aviation gasoline tanks. A fateful damage control decision to ventilate the ship spread volatile vapors throughout her hull. The mixture of leaking aviation fuel and the highly volatile, unrefined crude that Taiho had recently bunkered at Tawi-Tawi created a lethal atmosphere. The resulting explosion destroyed the carrier entirely. Japan also lacked dedicated logistics vessels. The Imperial Navy had no equivalent of Service Squadron 10, no Worrell Carter thinking about supply lines, no floating dry dock system, and no Henry Kaiser mass-producing ships on the home front. By 1945, Toyota had to plan operations on the assumption that any task force he sorted would not have the fuel to come home. That is precisely why the super battleship Yamato, on April 6, 1945, sailed for Okinawa on what was understood by all aboard to be a one-way mission. The Naval General Staff could scrape together only about 2,500 tons of fuel oil for the entire task force, barely enough for the run south. Some accounts suggest her tanks were topped off by sympathetic base commanders, but the mission's intent was clear. Yamato was expendable. She was sunk the next day by American carrier aircraft, having never reached Okinawa. The abstract picture becomes concrete when you look at the campaigns themselves. Operation Forager, the Marianas invasion of June 1944, was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War to that date. It moved the 5th Fleet and 2 corps of ground troops over 3,500 nautical miles from Pearl Harbor to Saipan and kept them at sea for over 4 months. The assault troops carried 32 days of rations, 30 days of medical supplies, 20 days of fuel, and 7 units of fire for every weapon, 1.2 short tons per soldier. The Philippines campaign drew the fleet still further forward, with Service Squadron 10 splitting into detachments at Manus, Saipan, Guam, and Ulithi. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the sheer volume of the American supply chain was itself a weapon. Japanese commanders could not fathom how the Americans kept entire carrier task groups fed, fueled, and armed thousands of miles from the nearest major port. Okinawa, Operation Iceberg, was the final and largest test. The plan moved 183,000 troops and 747,000 measurement tons of cargo from 11 different ports across 6,250 nautical miles of ocean. More than 1,400 ships in total converged on a single 60-mile-long island. The pre-invasion bombardment alone fired 1,500 16-inch rounds, 4,600 14-inch rounds, and over 50,000 5-inch rounds in 7 days. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every replacement aircraft, staged through Ulithi and transferred at sea by the Cimarrons. The scale of consumption at Okinawa was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Task Force 58, the fast carrier force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, operated continuously off Okinawa for nearly 3 months, launching strikes against kamikaze airfields on Kyushu and providing air cover for the ground troops below. During that period, the carriers consumed fuel at a rate that would have drained the entire pre-war Japanese oil reserve in a matter of weeks. The ammunition expenditure was equally staggering. 5-inch guns on the destroyers manning the radar picket stations fired so many rounds that their gun barrels had to be replaced at sea, a task performed by repair ships dispatched from Ulithi. Replacement aircraft were flown to the carriers from escort carriers operating as aircraft ferries, a conveyor belt of fresh Corsairs, Hellcats, and Avengers flowing westward to replace the machines lost to kamikazes and anti-aircraft fire. Food, medical supplies, spare parts, and even replacement crew members arrived in a continuous stream. The logistical chain never broke, and in the middle of it all, on December 18, 1944, Halsey's Third Fleet sailed straight into the worst typhoon in American naval history while trying to refuel at sea east of Luzon. Typhoon Cobra sank 3 destroyers, killed 790 sailors, destroyed or damaged 146 aircraft, and damaged 27 other ships. The Court of Inquiry found that the fleet had pushed too hard to reach its refueling rendezvous, because the entire Pacific War depended on the refueling schedule coming off on time. The fleet lost 3 destroyers and went on. The supply chain absorbed the blow and kept moving. Beginning in October 1945, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted hundreds of interrogations of senior Japanese officers in Tokyo. Read consecutively. What is striking is how often the Japanese officers volunteered comments about American logistics, even when the question was about something else entirely. The Naval Institute Proceedings Summary, published in February 1947, described it precisely. Throughout the interrogations, one is impressed by repeated expressions from the Japanese of something like bewildered admiration for the speed with which the United States was able to develop bases and furnish replacements of material, and the volume of supplies which flowed from American ports along ever-lengthening lines of communication. Nagano, asked about the war's turning point, replied without hesitation, "I look upon the Guadalcanal and Tulagi operations as the turning point from offense to defense, and the cause of our setback there was our inability to increase our forces at the same speed that you did." Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded Japan's last carrier force at the Philippine Sea and later Gulf, gave an answer that comes back to logistics from a different angle. His pilots had been flown to death because Japan could not refresh its trained aircrew. The American system rotated battle, seasoned aviators home as instructors, constantly building the next generation. The Kantai-Kessen mentality had treated pilots as ammunition rather than as a renewable resource. Captain Toshikazu Omai, a senior staff officer of the combined fleet, told his interrogators that by the time of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese fleet's freedom of action was constrained almost entirely by oil. Operations were planned not by what was tactically optimal, but by where there was enough fuel to get there. The picture that emerges from these transcripts is consistent. Japan's most senior surviving naval officers, asked in the autumn of 1945 to explain why they had lost, did not point to any single battle, any single weapon, or any single American admiral. They pointed at production capacity, at airfield construction speed, at the rate of replacement of damaged ships, at the inability to keep pace with the American supply line. In the run-up to the Pacific War, the United States Navy's War Plan Orange forced its planners to confront a basic geometric problem. There was simply no way to fight Japan from existing American bases. The Philippines were indefensible. Guam was a dot on the map. Wake Island was even smaller. War games at the Naval War College in the 1920s and 1930s repeatedly broke down on this same logistical reef. Fleets ran out of fuel before they reached the enemy. Ammunition was expended before decisive results could be achieved. Hospital ships could not keep up. Every simulation, every tabletop exercise, every fleet problem that war-gamed a Pacific offensive ran headfirst into the same wall. The Pacific was simply too big, and Japan was simply too far away for any navy operating on traditional lines to sustain a campaign. The interwar planners had two options: give up on the Western Pacific, which was politically impossible, or invent a new kind of navy, one that brought its base with it. They chose to invent the Cimarron-class oilers, the floating dry docks, the destroyer tenders, the floating workshops, the service squadrons, the Seabees, the Liberty ships, the Casablanca-class escort carriers. All of these were specific institutional answers to a specific strategic problem worked out over 20 years of war games at Newport. Japan's planners faced essentially the same problem in reverse. They had a defensive perimeter to feed. Their merchant marine was barely adequate in peacetime. The American oil embargo of July 1941 made that perimeter unsustainable without seizing the Indies. And seizing the Indies meant a war with the United States. Every Japanese officer who stopped to think about it understood the trap. But Japanese naval doctrine, deeply influenced by Admiral Togo's victory at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, treated logistics as an afterthought to the decisive battle. The Imperial Navy started the war with no dedicated mobile service force, no equivalent to Service Squadron 10, and no equivalent to the Cimarrons. When American submarines began tearing into Japanese shipping in late 1943, the Imperial Navy did not even institute a regular convoy system on the Singapore route until November of that year, 2 full years into the war. By then, it was already too late. Toyoda himself confirmed the depth of that miscalculation when he told American interrogators after the war that the Japanese leadership had made a fundamental error at the top, from the very beginning, about the nature of modern warfare. They had not understood how much fuel, how much shipping, how much raw industrial capacity a Pacific war would consume. When Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita raised his periscope at Ulithi on November 19, 1944, and counted over 100 ships at anchor, what he was actually looking at was the cumulative output of 2 decades of American institutional planning, 4 years of American industrial mobilization, and 3 years of American operational doctrine. He was looking at the answer to a strategic question his own Navy had failed to ask. That is why every Japanese admiral, asked after the war how it had been done to them, answered the same way: production capacity, repair capacity, civil engineering, speed of replacement, volume of supplies along ever-lengthening lines of communication. They knew, by the autumn of 1945, exactly what had beaten them. It was not the bravery of American sailors, though that bravery was immense. It was not any single weapon or any single battle. It was beans, bullets, and black oil. The unglamorous, back-breaking, relentless machinery of supply. The floating dry docks and the Cimarron-class oilers. The Seabees pouring coral into bomb craters under fire. The Liberty ships sliding down the ways every 3 weeks. The service squadron sailors, who never fired a shot in anger, but who kept the greatest fleet in history, fed, fueled, armed, and fighting across the largest ocean on Earth. Admiral Halsey captured it in that New Year dispatch of 1945. Beans, bullets, black oil, bulk stores, and even bulkheads have been promptly forthcoming on each request. Behind every carrier strike on Tokyo, behind every amphibious landing, Behind every island captured and every airfield built stood the quiet, invisible, impossibly vast logistics machine that Japan's admirals could describe but never match. That machine, more than any bomb or any torpedo, is what won the Pacific War.